The war chamber of the flagship Absolute Certainty was a place where empires were broken before the first shot was ever fired. Supreme Commander Tyrannex stood at the center of the circular room, his four arms folded behind his armored back, his compound eyes scanning the holographic star map that floated before him like a dream made of light. Around him sat the 12 members of the Vraxith War Council, each one a veteran of dozens of planetary conquests, each one responsible for the deaths of millions, and not a single one of them had ever known defeat. The Vraxith Dominion had carved its name across the galaxy with fire and discipline, and the absolute certainty that nothing in the universe can stand against them. And for 300 years, nothing had. "We have a problem," said Grand Strategist Vorek, his mandibles clicking as he pulled up a resource projection on the central display. "Our fuel reserves are falling below critical thresholds, and the outer colonies are reporting shortages of heavy metals and radioactive elements." Tyrannex did not move, but his eyes shifted toward the display, and every officer in the room felt the weight of his attention like a physical force. "Show me the candidates," he said. Vorek gestured, and the star map zoomed into a quiet arm of the galaxy, a region that the Concordance classified as undeveloped and unaligned, the kind of backwater that larger civilizations ignored and smaller ones avoided. "Long-range scans have identified a world in this system," Vorek continued. "It is rich in everything we need: heavy metals, radioactive deposits, liquid hydrocarbons, and rare earth elements in concentrations we have not seen in decades." The council murmured with approval, and several officers leaned forward in their seats with obvious hunger. "What species holds it?" asked War Minister Drellin. "A single-planet civilization," Vorek answered. "Pre-FTL according to the last Concordance survey. No known alliances, no galactic trade partners, no military presence beyond their own atmosphere." Drellin let out a sound that was the Vraxith equivalent of laughter, a sharp clicking of his inner mandibles. "Then this is not a war," he said. "This is a harvest." Tyrannex allowed himself the faintest gesture of satisfaction, but before he could speak, a voice rose from the back of the chamber, thin and uncertain. "Supreme Commander, if I may." Every head turned, and Sub-Tactician Lyrae felt the crushing pressure of 12 of the most powerful military minds in the Dominion staring directly at her. She was young by Vraxith standards, barely past her second molting, and she held the lowest rank of anyone permitted in the war chamber. But she had been assigned to intelligence analysis for this operation, and what she had found in the Concordance files had kept her awake for 2 full cycles. "Speak," Tyrannex said, and pulled up the Concordance file on her console, projecting it for the entire room to see. "The target world is designated Sol 3 by the Galactic Concordance," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "Local name, Earth." She paused. "It carries a habitability danger classification of Class 15. The room went silent in a way that Lyrae had never experienced before. Not the silence of respect or attention, but the silence of confusion. The silence of minds encountering something that did not fit into any known framework. "That is incorrect," said Vorek flatly. "The classification scale ends at 12, and even Class 12 worlds are theoretical. No known species has ever evolved on one." "The file is verified," Lyrae said. "It was submitted by a Concordance survey team over 2 centuries ago, and it has been confirmed by 3 independent observation probes since then, 2 of which were destroyed upon approach." Drellin. "By the inhabitants." Another silence, longer this time. Tyrannex raised one of his upper arms, a gesture that meant continue, and Lyrae took a breath and began reading from the file. "The planet has active tectonic plates that generate constant seismic events, including supervolcanic systems capable of altering the global climate," she read. 70% of the surface is covered in a liquid hydrosphere filled with predatory megafauna, and the atmosphere contains high concentrations of a corrosive reactive gas. What gas? Asked Vorik. Oxygen, Lyrae said. The dominant species breathes it to survive. She continued, and with every sentence the room grew more still. The planet orbits an unshielded main-sequence star that bombards the surface with ultraviolet radiation on a daily cycle. The inhabitants refer to this as sunshine, and deliberately expose themselves to it for pleasure. The dominant species, called humans, evolved as persistence predators, meaning they developed the ability to chase prey across open terrain for hours or even days, until the target animal collapsed from exhaustion and died. They have independently developed nuclear fission and fusion weapons, and have deployed them against members of their own species. They have developed biological and chemical weapons, and have also used these against their own kind. They practice a form of organized violence they call war, and have been doing so continuously for their entire recorded history, which spans approximately 10,000 years. War Minister Drellin leaned back in his seat and made a sound that Lyrae could not identify, something between disbelief and discomfort. "This is a single species?" he asked. "Yes," said Lyrae. "On a single planet?" "Yes." Grand Strategist Vorik waved a dismissive claw and said, "The file is 2 centuries old. The data is likely corrupted or exaggerated. By the survey team, primitive species do not survive conditions like these." "And yet they did," Lyrae said quietly, and immediately wished she had not spoken, because Tyrannex turned his full gaze upon her, and she felt it like a blade at her throat. "Sub-tactician," he said, his voice low and perfectly controlled. "I have conquered 31 worlds. I have broken species that had faster-than-light travel and defensive fleets 10 times the size of ours. I have faced enemies with orbital weapons platforms and planetary shields and armies that numbered in the billions." He stepped closer to her. "Are you telling me that I should fear a species that has not yet left its own world?" Lyrae wanted to say yes. She wanted to scream it, but she was young, and he was the supreme commander, and the weight of his authority pressed down on her like gravity itself. "No, Supreme Commander," she whispered. "I am simply presenting the data." For a long moment, then turned away. "Operation Swift Reclamation is authorized," he announced to the Council. "Standard planetary suppression protocol, 3-phase assault, orbital bombardment of military infrastructure, followed by drop pod deployment to secure resource zones, followed by full pacification of the native population." The Council rose in unison, mandibles clicking in the rhythmic pattern that signified absolute agreement. "We deploy in 6 cycles, Tyrannex said. "This will be over before the creatures even understand what is happening to them." The officers filed out, already speaking among themselves about logistics and troop assignments and supply chains, and within minutes, the war chamber was empty except for Lyrae, who stood alone in the dim light of the holographic display. She reached out and touched the projection of the small blue-green world, spinning slowly in the dark. Then she opened her personal console and downloaded the full Class 15 file. All 900 pages of it, including the footnotes, including the warnings, including the section at the very end that was marked in red and labeled with a single word she had never seen in a concordance document before. The word was impossible. She did not sleep that night. 6 cycles later, the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet of the Vraxith Dominion, 400 warships, 2 million soldiers, and enough firepower to crack a continent, entered slipspace and vanished from known space, heading toward a small, unremarkable star on the edge of the galactic arm. Heading toward Earth. And somewhere in the back of the fleet, in a tiny quarters aboard a support frigate, Sub-Tactician Lyrae sat in the dark, reading the file again and again, searching for something in those 900 pages that might give her hope. She did not find it. The 3rd Expeditionary Fleet tore itself out of slipspace at the edge of the Sol system, like a swarm of iron wasps breaking through a wall. And for exactly 11 seconds, everything was quiet. Then every alarm on every ship began screaming at once. Field Commander Drothax standing at the tactical display aboard the assault carrier Fang of Empire, watched as hundreds of red contacts bloomed across his sensors. Tiny signatures scattered throughout the outer system like seeds thrown into the wind. "What am I looking at?" he demanded. His sensor officer, a young male whose antennae were vibrating with confusion, leaned closer to his console and said, "Automated platforms, Commander. Orbital installations, relay stations, and at least 40 objects that appear to be armed defense satellites." "That is impossible," Drothax said. The Concordance file classified this species as pre-FTL. "The Concordance file is 200 years old," the officer said flatly. Commander Drothax stared at the display and felt something cold settle in his thorax. Something he had never felt before in 20 years of military service, and he did not have a name for it yet, but he would learn its name soon enough. From the bridge of the flagship Absolute Certainty, Supreme Commander Tyrannex surveyed the same data with considerably less concern. "Primitive orbital defenses," he said dismissively. "Every species builds them once they discover basic rocketry. It means nothing." "Supreme Commander," said the communications officer, "we are receiving a transmission from the third planet. It is being broadcast on an open channel." "Let me hear it." The voice that filled the bridge was female, calm, and utterly without fear, and it spoke in a language that the universal translators processed with surprising ease, as though this species had been broadcasting long enough for the galaxy's translation algorithms to already know their meaning. Tongue. Unidentified fleet. You have entered sovereign human space. State your intentions. You will receive one warning. This is it. The bridge crew looked at one another, and Drothax, listening from his own ship, noticed something that made the cold feeling in his thorax grow deeper. Every other species the Vraxith had ever invaded had reacted to the sight of 400 warships with panic or desperation or immediate surrender. Some had wept over open channels, some had begged for mercy, some had tried to bargain with offers of resources and territory. One species had simply gone silent and waited to die. This species had issued a warning to them. Tyrannex let out a sharp click of amusement and said, "Respond with standard terms. Unconditional surrender, immediate disarmament, transfer of all planetary resources to Vraxith control." The communications officer transmitted the demands, and for a long moment there was silence from the blue-green. World ahead. Then the same female voice returned, and this time there was something new in it. Something that the translators flagged as an emotional marker, but could not fully categorize. The closest translation was quiet amusement. "Acknowledged," the voice said. "That was your warning too." The channel went dead. Drothax immediately ordered his intelligence division to begin a full analysis of every human transmission they could intercept. Military communications, civilian broadcasts, cultural media, anything and everything, because something was wrong with this picture, and he needed to understand what it was before they reached that planet. What his analysts brought back over the next several hours did not make him feel better. The species had no unified planetary government, which should have been a weakness, but instead of one army to defeat, they would face dozens of independent military forces with separate command structures and different power structures, tactical doctrines, and none of them could surrender on behalf of the others. The species possessed approximately 13,000 nuclear weapons spread across multiple nations, and the control of these weapons was distributed so widely that destroying any single leadership target would not prevent their use. The species had a concept in their culture that the translators struggled with, an idea called spite, which appeared to mean the willingness to suffer great harm to oneself purely for the purpose of inflicting harm on an enemy, even when victory was no longer possible, especially when victory was no longer possible. Their popular entertainment was dominated by stories of war, survival, and resistance against overwhelming force. And the heroes of these stories were almost never the ones with superior numbers or technology. They were the outnumbered, the outgunned, the desperate, and they always won. Their young trained in simulated combat environments for recreation, spending hours each day practicing tactics, reflexes, and strategic thinking in scenarios designed to be as violent and challenging as possible. And they called this activity fun. Drothax read the report twice, then called a meeting with his senior officers. "I am filing an updated tactical assessment with the Supreme Commander," he told them. "I am recommending a cautious approach, reduced initial deployment, extensive reconnaissance before ground engagement, and a revised timeline." His officers agreed because they had read the same report, and none of them were sleeping well. Tyrannex denied the request within the hour. "We proceed as planned," was all the message said. The fleet advanced inward through the Sol system, and as they passed the orbit of the fourth planet, Drothax noticed something on his long-range sensors that no one else seemed to be paying attention to. There was a debris field in orbit around Earth's only moon. He ordered a detailed scan, and when the results came back, he sat in his command chair for a very long time without speaking. The debris was not natural. It was the remains of ships, at least 6 of them, different designs from different species, all of them destroyed, some of them decades old, and some of them centuries old. Other civilizations had come to this system before the Vraxith, and they had not come back. "Commander," said his aide, "should I include this in the report to the Supreme Commander?" "Yes," Drothax said, "not that it will change anything." It did not. The fleet entered Earth orbit, and for the first time, the Vraxiths saw the planet with their own eyes through the viewport screens, and it was beautiful in the way that a venomous creature is beautiful. Bright and vivid and covered in swirling white clouds that moved with a restless energy that suggested violence barely contained. Deep, and the land masses were a patchwork of green and brown and white, marked everywhere by the geometric patterns of cities and roads and infrastructure that spoke of a civilization far more advanced than any pre-FTL species had a right to be. And then the first human warships rose from the atmosphere. They were ugly things by Vraxith standards, blunt and over-armored and bristling with weapons in a way that suggested a species that had learned to fight by being hit first and surviving. And there were more of them than the intelligence reports had predicted, far more. Tyrannex was not concerned. The Vraxith fleet outgunned them significantly, and he gave the order for the first wave of drop pods to launch. 200,000 soldiers and 10,000 armored pods, aimed at military targets and resource-rich zones across every major continent. Drothax was aboard the command lander for the Northern Continent Assault Force, and as his ship punched through the upper atmosphere, he looked out the viewport at the world rushing up to meet him. Lightning storms raged across the horizon in sheets of white and purple, and the atmospheric data on his display was a cascade of warnings. Pressure exceeding Vraxith tolerance by 40%, temperature fluctuations of 60 degrees between zones, ultraviolet radiation at levels that would cause cellular damage within hours of unshielded exposure, and oxygen concentrations so high that the air itself was technically a fire hazard. His environmental suit was already working at maximum capacity just to keep him alive, and they had not even landed yet. "Commander," said his aide, who was gripping the restraint harness with all 4 hands, "the planet is attacking us." Drothax said nothing, because his aide was right. The drop pod shuddered as it hit a wall of turbulence that the flight computer had not predicted, because on this world, the weather did not follow predictable patterns. It fought and raged and changed without warning, as if the atmosphere itself resented their presence. Through the viewport, Drothax watched a bolt of lightning strike close enough to momentarily white out his sensors. And in that flash of light, he saw the surface of Earth for the first time. Green and wild and impossibly alive, covered in vegetation that grew with an aggression he had never seen on any world. as though every living thing on this planet was locked in a constant war for survival. And somewhere down there, 2 billion years of evolutionary violence was looking up at the sky and watching them come. Drothax tightened his grip on his restraint harness and whispered a phrase that he had never said before in his entire military career. The ground invasion of Earth began at dawn across 6 continents, and by sunset, the Vraxith had learned a lesson that the universe had been trying to teach them for 300 years. That there is always something bigger, something meaner, and something more stubborn than you. The first reports came from the southern tropical zones, where a full battalion of 8,000 Vraxith soldiers had deployed into a region the humans called the Amazon. Within 4 hours, the battalion had lost 600 soldiers, and not a single one of them had been killed by a human. The heat came first, a suffocating wet wall of it, that overwhelmed the cooling systems of their environmental suits within minutes, and the Vraxith, who had evolved on a cool, dry world, with thin air and gentle breezes, began to crack, literally, their exoskeletons drying and splitting along stress lines as their bodies failed to regulate temperature, in conditions that no sane planet should produce. Then came the insects, clouds of biting, stinging, burrowing creatures, so small that they slipped through the seals of Vraxith armor, and so numerous that they darkened the air like living fog, and the Vraxith soldiers, who were themselves insectoid, were horrified to discover that Earth's insects were nothing like them. They were mindless, relentless, and hungry in a way that had no purpose beyond consumption. A sergeant filed a frantic report describing an encounter with a creature the size of his thumb that had stung one of his soldiers through a gap in his neck armor, and the soldier had gone into anaphylactic shock and died within minutes. The creature was a wasp. The water was worse, rivers that moved with terrifying force, rain that fell so hard it reduced visibility to nothing, and mud that swallowed soldiers and vehicles alike with the patience of a predator that knew its prey could not escape. And in the rivers there were things with teeth. A squad leader reported that something had pulled one of his soldiers under the surface of a river crossing, and when they dragged the body out, half of it was missing. And the water was full of shapes that moved with a speed and violence that made the squad leader use a word that the translators rendered as nightmare. The creatures were crocodiles, and they had been killing things on this planet for 200 million years, longer than the entire Vraxith civilization had existed by a factor of 1,000. In the northern mountain zones, the problems were different but equally devastating. Vraxith troops deployed to high-altitude positions found themselves gasping for air that was too thin and too cold, and their joints locked as temperatures plunged far below anything their biology could handle. And entire platoons were lost to avalanches that came without warning, walls of snow and ice and rock that buried soldiers and equipment under millions of tons of frozen death. A commander in the Eastern Continental Force reported that his forward base had been attacked by a small armored animal that had somehow gotten inside the perimeter, and when his soldiers tried to kill it, the creature had fought back with a ferocity so far beyond its size that it had injured 3 armed soldiers before being driven off. It had not been killed. It had simply decided to leave. The creature was a honey badger, and the incident report noted with something close to despair that the animal appeared to have attacked the base not out of hunger or self-defense, but out of what could only be described as pure aggression. Sub-tactician Lyrie, confined to her quarters aboard the support frigate in orbit, had access to the ground reports through a data terminal that no one had thought to restrict, and she read each one with the sick certainty of someone watching a disaster they had predicted unfold exactly as they had warned. The Class 15 file again, and found the section on terrestrial fauna. The file listed over 8 million known species on the planet, and the survey team had flagged approximately 2 million of them as dangerous to Vraxith biology, including plants. Plants that produce toxins, plants with thorns that could pierce armor, plants that caused allergic reactions severe enough to kill, and one species of tree in the southern regions that was so toxic that standing under it during rain would cause chemical burns as the water washed poison off the leaves. Lyrae compiled a new report, more urgent than the last, and sent it directly to Supreme Commander Tyrannex, with a single recommendation written in bold: withdraw immediately. Tyrannex read the report and had Lyrae formally demoted and confined to quarters for spreading defeatism among the ranks. She was still reading the ground reports when the human counterattack began. Sergeant Tomas Reyes had been waiting for 3 days. He and his guerrilla unit of 42 soldiers had positioned themselves in the dense jungle of the southern continent, watching the Vraxith forward operating base from a ridge 2 kilometers away, and they had not moved, had barely eaten, had slept in shifts in the mud and the rain, and none of them had complained, because this was what humans did. They endured. Reyes had studied the enemy for 72 hours and had identified their patterns, when they changed guards, when they sent patrols, when their attention was weakest, and now in the gray light before dawn, he gave the signal. The attack lasted 11 minutes. His team struck from 3 directions, using the terrain itself as a weapon, driving the Vraxith into a narrow valley where the jungle closed in on both sides and the river blocked retreat. And they used fire and noise and the sheer overwhelming chaos of the natural environment to disorient an enemy that had never fought in conditions like these. The Vraxith soldiers were not cowards. They were veterans of multiple campaigns, but they had never faced an enemy that could move through this kind of terrain as though it were home. Because for the humans it was home. This hellish world of heat and poison and predators was where they had been born and where they had learned to fight. And every rock and tree and shadow was their ally. When it was over, Reyes and his team had destroyed the forward base, captured a supply cache, and taken 11 prisoners, and they had lost 2 soldiers, one to enemy fire and one to a snake that had bitten her during the approach, because on Earth, even the planet fought alongside its defenders. Among the prisoners was a wounded Vraxith officer, a young lieutenant, whose leg had been shattered by a falling tree during the attack, and he was in agony, clicking and hissing in pain, and Reyes knelt beside him and did something that broke the lieutenant's understanding of the universe more completely than any weapon could have. He gave him medical aid. Reyes cleaned the wound, applied a splint from materials in his field kit, administered a painkiller that his medic adjusted for the alien's biology based on a best guess. And then he gave the lieutenant water and sat with him until the pain faded. The Vraxith lieutenant stared at him with compound eyes that could not produce tears, but somehow communicated the same thing. And he asked through the translator unit a question that Reyes would remember for the rest of his life. "Why would you help me? I came here to take your world." Reyes looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Because hurting you when you are down would make me less than what I am. And this world already has enough things that kill without mercy. It does not need me to be another one." The lieutenant did not speak again for a long time. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, Drothax was trapped. His command post in a ruined city on the northern continent was surrounded. His supply lines had been cut by human forces that moved faster than any species he had ever encountered, and his soldiers were dying not just from enemy fire, but from the air they breathed, the water they drank, and the ground they stood on. He stood at the window of a shattered building and watched a scene that he would never forget. A human soldier, a woman, broke from cover and ran across open ground, while Vraxith weapons fired all around her. A round struck her in the leg, and she stumbled and fell, and Drothax thought it was over. But she got up. She got up with blood running down her leg, and she kept running, not away from the fight, but toward a fallen comrade who was lying in the open. She grabbed the wounded soldier by the armor and dragged him back to cover, while rounds struck the ground around her feet, and she did not stop, did not slow, did not hesitate. Drothax turned to his aide and his voice was barely a whisper. "What are these things?" His aide had no answer. 3 weeks into the invasion of Earth, the Vraxith Dominion held territory on maps and nowhere else. Supreme Commander Tyrannex stood alone on the bridge of the Absolute Certainty and stared at the holographic display that showed the planet below, and every continent was marked with the red icons of Vraxith positions. And every single one of those positions was under attack, surrounded, cut off, or burning. He had conquered 31 worlds, and on every single one the pattern had been the same: destroy the military, occupy the cities, break the will of the population, and within weeks the species would accept its new reality and submit. The humans had not submitted. They had done something far worse. They had adapted. In the first week, the human military had been outgunned and outmaneuvered by Vraxith orbital superiority, and Tyrannex had allowed himself to believe that this would follow the familiar pattern. Captured enough Vraxith equipment to begin reverse engineering their shield frequencies, and human weapons that had bounced harmlessly off Vraxith armor 7 days earlier were now cutting through it like paper. By the 3rd week, Admiral Kessler of the United Nations Combined Fleet Command had reorganized the scattered human naval forces into a coordinated strike fleet. And she had done something that no enemy commander had ever done to the Vraxith before. She had stopped defending and started attacking. Kessler's fleet, a collection of crude, heavy ships that looked like they had been designed by a species that expected to be shot at constantly, and had simply decided to bolt on more armor until the shooting stopped being a problem, struck the Vraxith supply corridor between the fleet and the ground forces with a precision that should have been impossible for a civilization that had only been in space for a few decades. 3 supply convoys were destroyed in a single day, and when Tyrannex dispatched escort ships to protect the 4th, the humans ambushed the escorts from behind a captured Vraxith communications satellite that they had reprogrammed to mask their approach. They were learning faster than any species in Vraxith records, and they were learning not just how to fight the Vraxith, but how to think like them. And then they were doing things that no Vraxith would ever think to do, like broadcasting their own troop positions on open channels. Drothax discovered this when his intelligence officer intercepted what appeared to be a complete map of human defensive positions in his sector, transmitted in the clear with no encryption, and his first instinct was to attack the nearest position immediately. His second instinct, born from 3 weeks of hard and bloody lessons, was to hesitate. "It is a trap," he said. "How can you be certain, Commander?" asked his aide. "Because everything on this planet is a trap," Drothax replied. "The weather is a trap. The terrain is a trap. The animals are traps. The plants are traps. Even their mercy is a trap because it makes you hesitate to fight them. And now they are handing us their positions on an open channel and expecting us to be foolish enough to walk into whatever they have prepared." He was right. The positions were real, but they were bait, lightly held outposts designed to draw Vraxith forces into kill zones, where the terrain, the weather, and concealed human units would destroy them. And 3 other Vraxith commanders in different sectors, who did not share Drothax's hard-won caution, attacked those positions and lost everything. But the worst blow to Vraxith's morale did not come from any battle. It came from a piece of intelligence that Drothax's analysts delivered to him on the morning of the 22nd day. And when he read it, he sat down heavily and did not speak for a long time. Most powerful weapons. They had nuclear arsenals capable of destroying every Vraxith position on the planet in a single coordinated strike. They had chemical and biological weapons that could be tailored to target Vraxith biology specifically. And they had orbital kinetic systems, simple rods of dense metal that could be dropped from space with the force of a small nuclear weapon and none of the radiation. They had all of these things, and they were choosing not to use them. Not because they could not because they lacked the will, but because they had assessed the Vraxith invasion force and concluded that it was manageable without them. The Vraxith were not a threat that required humanity's full strength. They were a problem being handled with conventional forces, while the real weapons stayed in reserve, just in case something actually dangerous showed up. When this intelligence reached the rank and file of the Vraxith ground forces, broke. Soldiers who had fought bravely through 3 weeks of hell, who had endured the heat and the cold and the predators and the relentless human guerrillas, who had watched their comrades die from infections caused by microorganisms so small they could not be seen. These soldiers looked at each other and realized that they were not fighting a war. They were an inconvenience. Tyrannex felt the shift in morale through the reports that flooded his command console, and for the first time in his 300-year career, he experienced doubt. He searched the fleet's historical database for any comparable scenario, any invasion where the target species had counter-adapted at this speed, any campaign where the enemy had grown stronger instead of weaker as the fighting continued. There were no results. He searched for any record of a species that possessed weapons of total destruction and chose not to use them, not out of inability, but out of a deliberate assessment that the invader was not worth the effort. There were no results, and then, alone on the bridge, in the middle of the night cycle, Tyrannex finally understood what the Class 15 designation truly meant. It was not just that the planet was dangerous. Many planets were dangerous. Class 8 worlds had acid rain, and Class 10 worlds had predators the size of buildings. But those were environmental hazards, obstacles to be overcome with the right equipment and the right preparation. Class 15 meant something different. It meant that any species capable of evolving on such a world, any species that could survive the earthquakes and the volcanoes and the ice ages and the predators and the diseases and the radiation and the constant unrelenting pressure of a planet that seemed designed by a cruel god to kill everything on it. Any species that could come through all of that and build a civilization and reach for the stars. That species was by definition the Class 15 species. Most dangerous thing on the most dangerous world in the galaxy. And the Vraxis had attacked it in its home. On the ground, Drothax had reached the same conclusion through a different path. His forces were down to 11,000 from an initial deployment of 60,000, and he was surrounded in a shattered city with no supply lines, no air support, and no hope of reinforcement. And his soldiers were exhausted and sick and afraid in a way that Vraxith soldiers had never been afraid before. He was preparing for a last stand when a human officer appeared at the edge of the perimeter, carrying a white flag. Drothax did not know what a white flag meant, but his translator unit processed the gesture and told him it was a signal for negotiation, and he ordered his soldiers to hold their fire. The human officer was a tall woman with gray hair and calm eyes, and she walked across the open ground between the two forces with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who was not afraid of death, not because she was reckless, but because she had made peace with its possibility a long time ago. She stopped 10 meters from Drothax and spoke. "Commander, my name is Colonel Elena Vasquez. I am authorized to offer you terms." "Terms," Drothax repeated, and the word tasted strange in his mouth, because in the Vraxith language there was no word for surrender that did not also mean extinction. "Surrender your forces, and you will be treated humanely," she said. "Your wounded will receive medical care. Your soldiers will be housed and fed, and when this is over, you will be returned to your people." "Why?" Drothax asked, and the question contained everything. "Why would you spare us? Why would you feed us? Why would you show mercy to an enemy that came to take your world and enslave your people?" Colonel Vasquez looked at him with those calm, steady eyes, and said something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Because we have laws about this. We wrote them after we did terrible things to each other. Things so awful that we swore we would never do them again, not to ourselves and not to anyone else, not even to someone who came to our home to destroy us. Drothax looked at her, and then he looked at his soldiers, broken, starving, terrified. And he made a decision that had never been made in the entire history of the Vraxith Dominion. He surrendered. 11,000 Vraxith soldiers laid down their weapons and walked out of the ruins under a white flag. And the humans who had been fighting them for 3 weeks did not jeer or gloat or take revenge. They gave them water, they gave them food, they treated their wounds. And that, more than any battle or any weapon or any display of force, was the thing that truly defeated the Vraxith. Because cruelty they could have understood. Cruelty was familiar. Cruelty was the way of the galaxy. Mercy from an enemy that had every right and every reason to be cruel. That was something the Vraxith had no defense against. In orbit, Tyrannex watched the ground surrender on his tactical display, and his hands were shaking. He opened his console and pulled up a file he had ignored for 3 weeks. Lyra's report, the one he had punished her for writing. He read it from beginning to end, and at the very bottom she had highlighted a single passage from the original Concordance survey file, a footnote added by the team leader who had first observed Earth from a safe distance 2 centuries ago. The footnote read, "Under no circumstances engage this species, not because they will lose, because they will make you wish you had lost instead." Tyrannex closed the file and stared at the planet below, and the planet stared back, beautiful and terrible and alive with a fury that he finally understood he had never been equipped to face. Class 15, Deathworld. And now he knew what that meant. The 3rd Expeditionary Fleet of the Vraxith Dominion was surrounded, and Supreme Commander Tyrannex knew it, and every officer on every remaining ship knew it. And the silence on the bridge of the absolute certainty was the silence of creatures who had finally understood that they were not the predators in this story. They had never been the predators. Admiral Kessler's human fleet had spent the last 72 hours executing a maneuver that the Vraxith tactical computers classified as impossible. A full encirclement of a superior force using inferior numbers, accomplished not through brute strength, but through a combination of speed, deception, and a willingness to take risks that no rational species would consider acceptable. The humans had used their own damaged ships as decoys, flying crippled vessels on automated courses to draw Vraxith attention, while their real attack groups slipped through gaps in the formation that existed for less than 4 minutes at a time. They had hacked captured Vraxith communication relays to feed false intelligence to the fleet, creating phantom squadrons that existed only as electronic ghosts. And while the Vraxith chased shadows, the real human ships moved into position around them like the jaws of a trap. And now the trap was closed. Tyrannex stood at the viewport and looked out at the human blockade. A ring of ships that were ugly and scarred and pitted with damage from weeks of fighting. Ships that had no right to still be flying. Ships held together by emergency welds and human stubbornness, and whatever mysterious force it was that made this species refuse to accept defeat under any circumstances. His fleet had lost 60% of its ships. Nearly all of his ground forces were dead or captured. And the slipspace corridor that was his only route home had been blocked by a minefield that the humans had assembled from repurposed Vraxith ordnance. They were using his own weapons against him. "Supreme Commander," said his communications officer, "we are receiving a transmission from the human flagship." Tyrannex closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, something had changed in them. Something that his officers had never seen before. "Put it through," he said. Captain Usha Marin's voice filled the bridge, and it was the same voice that had issued that first warning weeks ago, when the fleet had entered the system. Calm and measured, and carrying no anger, no triumph, no satisfaction. Just a steady clarity that cut through the static like a blade. "Supreme Commander Tyrannex," she began, "your soldiers on the ground are being fed, sheltered, and given medical care according to our laws of war. Your dead are being handled with respect, and their remains will be preserved for return to your people." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a weight that was not authority, but something deeper. Sounded like it had been earned through suffering. "This is not because we are weak. This is because we choose to be more than what made us. You attacked our home, the place where our species was born, the place that has been trying to kill us since before we could walk upright, since before we had language, since before we had fire. We did not survive this world by being gentle, Commander. We survived it by being the most relentless, the most adaptable, the most dangerously creative predators this planet has ever produced. And this planet has produced monsters that would give your worst nightmares teeth and claws. But somewhere along the way, after all the wars and the plagues and the ice ages and the mass extinctions, after we split the atom and nearly burned ourselves to ash, after we looked into the void that we had created and saw what we truly were, we made a choice. We chose to be kind. Not because it was easy, not because it was our nature, but because we had been the monster, and we did not like what we saw. Do not mistake that choice for inability, Commander. Do not mistake our mercy for weakness, because the mercy we are offering you right now is held in the same hands that built the weapons we chose not to use, and those hands are perfectly steady." The bridge was silent. Tyrannex's aide leaned close and whispered, "Supreme Commander, what are our orders?" Tyrannex did not answer immediately, and in that silence, Sub-Tactician Lyrae, reinstated to her position after Drothax's surrender, had proven every word of her analysis correct, stepped forward from her station. She had not spoken to Tyrannex since her demotion, and the officers around her tensed, because speaking to the Supreme Commander uninvited was a severe breach of protocol. "They are offering terms," Lyrae said quietly. "Full withdrawal, return of all prisoners, and a non-aggression treaty. In exchange, they want star charts and open trade routes." Tyrannex turned to look at her, and there was no anger in his eyes, only the hollow recognition of a being who had finally met something greater than himself. "They could destroy us," he said, and it was not a question. "Yes," Lyrae said. "They could take our fleet, study our technology, and use it to strike the Dominion itself." "Yes." "Why would they offer mercy?" Lyrae looked at him, and she remembered all those sleepless nights reading the Class 15 file, all 900 pages of warnings and data, and the accumulated horror of a world that should not have been able to produce anything except death. And she remembered the footnote at the end, and she remembered the captured Vraxith lieutenant who had been given water by an enemy soldier, and she understood something that the file had never been able to put into words. "Because they have been the monster," she said softly, "and they did not like what they saw. They are not offering mercy for our sake, Commander. They are doing it for theirs. Because every time they choose mercy over destruction, they prove to themselves that they are more than what their world made them. And that proof is worth more to them than our fleet, our technology, or our territory." Tyrannex looked at her for a long time. Then he looked out the viewport at the planet below, that beautiful, terrible blue-green world wrapped in clouds. A world that had spent 4 billion years crafting the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever known, and then watched as that species looked at its own reflection and decided to be better. He opened a channel to the human flagship. "Captain Marin," he said, and his voice was steady, even though something inside him was crumbling. "The Vraxith Dominion accepts your terms." There was a pause on the other end, and when Marin spoke again, there was something warm in her voice, something that the translator struggled with, and finally rendered as compassion. "We will transmit coordinates for a safe withdrawal corridor. Your prisoners will be transferred at the system boundary, and Commander, for what it is worth, your soldiers fought bravely. We will remember that." The channel closed, and Tyrannex stood in the silence of his bridge, and felt the weight of being the first Supreme Commander in Vraxith history to retreat from a conquest. But he was alive. His remaining soldiers would go home, and the species that had beaten them had sent them away with food in their bellies and medicine in their veins, and their dead wrapped in clean cloth, because that was who these humans were, not kind by nature, but kind by choice, which was 1,000 times more powerful. The remnants of the Third Expeditionary Fleet limped out of the Sol system in a ragged line, and as they passed the outer defense satellites, those same satellites that had pinged them with warnings when they arrived, the automated systems powered down their targeting locks and let them go. Even the machines showed mercy. 6 months later, the Galactic Concordance received a data package from the Sol system, transmitted by humanity's newly constructed deep space relay, and it contained a simple request: update our file. The Concordance updated the file on Sol 3, and the new entry was transmitted to every civilization in the known galaxy, to every war room and royal court and hive council and parliamentary chamber, and it read: Addendum, Sol 3, local designation, Earth, classification, Class 15 Deathworld, confirmed. Dominant species, humans, Homo sapiens. Status, post-contact, active spacefaring civilization. Previous advisory recommended avoidance. This advisory is now mandatory. Do not invade, do not provoke, do not test. They are the apex predator of a world that produces nothing but apex predators. They have earned every point of their classification. They are open to trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. They prefer peace. This makes them more dangerous, not less. A species that can choose peace after surviving a Class 15 world is a species that has mastered something far more lethal than war. They have mastered themselves. The file was read in the iron halls of the Vraxith Dominion, and in the crystal chambers of the Silene Collective, and in the deep underwater palaces of the Marathi Shoal, and in 100 other places where beings with power and ambition and armies looked at star maps and dreamed of conquest. And one by one, quietly, without ceremony or announcement, they removed Sol from their targeting lists, because now they knew the answer to the question that the galaxy had never thought to ask. Who attacks a Class 15 Deathworld? Fools attack a Class 15 Deathworld. And those fools only attack once. On Earth, on a warm evening 6 months after the invasion, Sergeant Tomas Reyes sat on the porch of a rebuilt house in a jungle that had already begun to reclaim the scars of battle. And he drank coffee and watched the sun go down in colors that no other world in the galaxy could produce, because no other world had an atmosphere quite this insane. Somewhere above him, beyond the clouds, beyond the sky, beyond the thin blue line that separated his impossible planet from the void of space, the galaxy was watching. And the galaxy was afraid. But it did not need to be, because the most dangerous species in the universe was sitting on a porch, drinking coffee, watching the sunset, and thinking about how good it was to be alive on this beautiful, terrible, wonderful, impossible world. And that was enough. That had always been enough.